So, good evening, good afternoon. You can hear me okay, right? I'm Jill Hartz, the Executive Director of the museum, and I want to welcome you all here for the very beginning of our SmART Collecting series. We are so thrilled to have this series happen and so grateful to Michael Stocker and MCS for making this possible. So I just join me in thanking him and the company for allowing us to do this. Michael's going to come up and say a couple things, but something I really want you to keep in mind, you may be saying this too, but what I really want you to keep in mind is we have a series, right? We have a series of SmART collecting panels that James Harper is leading off with, and we have these in the back room so you can put them on your refrigerator, and make sure you come for the rest of these, because by the end of this, we want to know how to continue it. We want to know how we keep a collectors group going and what that collectors group wants to do. So this is kind of all leading towards something which we hope will be sustainable, not just in your own collecting, but also in being able to create a group that appreciates what you do and that we can kind of look at each other's collections and see what we're doing and learn more as well. So I know that's one of your goals too. So Michael, do you want to say something?
So one of my first encounters with this beguiling addiction, also known as collecting, occurred when I was about 6 or 7 years old. My younger brother and I were with our mother, who was combing antique stores in Massachusetts looking for antique Crocs. We came upon a promising looking place, and as we started to enter, my mother was told, sorry, no children allowed in the shop. Well, of course, we looked around to see who he was talking about. Well, being denied entry did not discourage my brother and I from our interest in collecting. Rather, it impressed upon us the desire to get inside, discover what kind of treasures this guy was guarding, and from curious children like us. So on behalf of my firm, MCS Family Wealth Advisors, welcome fellow curious children to the SmART Art Collector series.
That's great. Thank you. When we were trying to put the panel together and figuring out what are the topics that collectors would be interested in, and for those of you who may not be collectors yet but might want to be collectors, we also wanted to think about you as well. But we could think of no better person to kick this all off than Professor Harper. So Jamie was one of the first people I met here. And during my first year here, we co-taught, or actually he taught and I kind of helped, with this course on museums and collecting that was based on research on the Neville Collection, works from the Neville Collection that's now our European gallery, or at least made our European gallery possible. But I knew, thinking back to that, the depth of information and the actual passion he has about the field of not just collecting, but patronage, and how collecting happens and how it's evolved over time. So, so I thought this would be a great, way to kick it off and a great way for you to kind of inform us on things that are second nature to you almost. But Professor Harper received his PhD from the University of Pennsylvania in 1998 and has extensive experience working with a number of museums, including ours. And those include the National Gallery of Art, the Philadelphia Museum of Art, and the FOG, the Harvard University Museums. He's a specialist in Italian art of the 16th and 17th centuries and offers numerous courses at the university that focus on Renaissance and Baroque art in Northern and Southern Europe. So you can understand how he's increasingly valuable to us. His research addresses the connections between art and power, with particular focus on the use of monumental biographical imagery as a form of propaganda. He is the author and editor of the 2011 book, The Turk and Islam in the Western Eye, Visual Imagery Before Orientalism, and of numerous publications on Baroque tapestry. And we are looking at potentially a major tapestry show for the future. He has also curated or co-curated a number of exhibitions, including the 2001 exhibition called Verso, The Flip Side of Master Drawings at the Fog Art Museum. And of course, more recently here at the JSMA, our 2010 show, Giuseppe Vasi's Rome, Lasting Impressions of the Age of the Grand Tour, which is indelibly etched in many of our, hearts as well as our minds. So tonight, please join me in welcoming James Harper, who will speak on the passion of collecting.
Thank you, Jill. I think we should probably, Sharon, do a little bit of closing out of the beautiful day and close some curtains and put down some lights so that we can see the images that I'll be showing in their full, vivid richness. I wanted to start with this image, which is Giovanni Paolo Panini's painting, The Ideal Gallery with Views of Modern Rome from 1759. It was commissioned by a French aristocrat who had been appointed as ambassador to the papal court, and before he returned to Paris, he wanted to get a memento, a giant. I mean, this painting is actually larger than it appears on the screen. Usually when I show things on the screen, they're blown up to many times their size, but this is actually a little smaller on the screen than it is in real life. But here you see the Duke seated among an entourage of people, but also surrounded by paintings that look a lot like Panini's own stock in trade, which are views of the city of Rome. In an image like this, the Duc de Choiseul appears as a kind of magisterial figure. Here is the collector as the collector would like to see him or herself. This splendid, casually elegant figure, right? I mean, there he sits gesturing in a magisterial way and yet also plausibly casual as well. On his right are scholars and fellow collectors and maybe even dealers who are presenting things for him to consider. He's got books opened up in front of him. And then down to the left of the image, you can see artists, young artists who have come to train in his collection, who are sketching the works that they find there, works of painting, sculpture, and I would say for Panini, even architecture. Of course, it's all phony, right? This is a fantasy gallery in which you can see some of the most famous sculptures in Rome, things that the Duc de Choiseul, no matter how grand a fellow he was, things that he was not going to be able to return to Paris with in the flesh, or let me say in the marble, but instead he takes them here in this painting. As I said, this is the collector. This is the collector who is fully in control. He has a theme running through the collection. You'll notice if I just flip back for a moment, all the views of Rome. This is modern Rome. These are the wonders of a city that saw itself not only as the New Jerusalem, but also as the kind of epitome of the new modern city. And this is a highly unified collection. So that's one view of the collector. Of course, those of you who are collectors in this room, and full disclosure, I'm a collector on a very minor scale. I collect papal annual medals, these small bronze medals about 2 inches across that were issued every year on the Feast of Saints Peter and Paul, and a few prints, but it's not. I'm not a capital C collector. Some of you are, and some of you have probably heard from various relatives, maybe even spouses, if you're not that lucky about spouses sharing the passion of collecting. You've probably heard a more sinister side of collecting, a sinister side that I thought I'd just show this horror movie, The Collector. This is a collector who becomes deranged and starts collecting human beings, and he goes into a house and kills all the people except for one. He always saves one, and so here, this represents the kind of extreme other side from the Duke of Choiseul. And it was this kind of psychological perspectives on collecting, that was one of the things that Jill and I explored in this class that we co-taught a couple of years ago. These are photographs of the students examining works from the Neville collection, which had not yet been donated to the museum, but it was a gift that we understood was coming, and Jean Neville generously allowed us to have a dozen works to study for the purposes of this course. As you see in the bullet points there, we looked at the history and theory of collecting. We also looked at the challenges of integrating a private collection into a museum collection. These students did provenance research, they did attribution research. They were great, by the way. It was eight graduate students and 4 intrepid undergrads. And they were, as I said, they were completely fearless. They wrote to experts in America and in Europe. They presented their arguments to people at the Rijksmuseum or the British Museum in London. They got feedback from these people, and in some cases really moved the research forward on the paintings. We had some guest speakers. We had a panel of collectors. I'm pleased to see that 2 of our 3 collectors from the panel are here today, Keith Atchapole and David Hilton. We also had Lee Michaels come in, and the 3 of them very good-naturedly agreed to sit in the Petri dish while our students, who Joe and I assigned them all of these works on the psychology of collecting, that talked about hoarders and the various sort of borderline insanities that accompany certain collecting. And then Keith and David and Lee just let themselves be peppered with these questions from the students, and they answered them in very insightful and, as I said, good-natured, lively, but also very informative, deeply informative ways. We had input from University Legal Counsel, development officers, conservation scientists, and of course the great resource of the museum staff. We had them turn in a paper on a collector. Each one picked a collector early in the term and studied that collector. We also had them examining the objects, looking at authenticity, attribution. They built the object files up. They also prepared wall texts for a gallery installation that you see there at the far right. And then at the end, they imagined each of them had one painting that was his or her own. The undergrads paired up. Each graduate student had his or her own painting. And at the end, each student imagined building a small exhibition with it, adding a dozen works to his or her own painting and taking it in a thematic direction. It was some pretty interesting stuff, and you can see again some of the results are upstairs in the European Gallery, where you'll see the Neville collection installed now. So that's a kind of deep background. I know Jill alluded to it in her introductory remarks as well. One of the key texts that we read was Werner Munsterberger's Collecting: An Unruly Passion. Who's read this book or parts of it? Okay, nobody. Wow. Okay, this is a good one. It's Munsterberger is a very senior scholar, an important figure in that field of the psychology of collecting, and yet in this book he writes in a very, very engaging prose. Not quite tabloid journalism, but not stuffy academic language either. It is a really good read, and I recommend it. He discusses collecting in his introduction as a kind of chronic restiveness. And he asks the rhetorical questions. Is it an obsession, an addiction? Is it a passion or urge? Or perhaps a need to hold, to possess, to accumulate? He airs a number of theories. Of course, there's no one single profile of the collector, which is the wonderful thing. Again, if you're a collector and you read this, not everything needs necessarily to apply to you. But he also speaks about animism, this idea of objects as our companions, right? Giving objects an almost personality, or as he says, a soul or a name. This process that begins with small children with their teddy bears and toys, but also stays with us, with many of us, for a lifetime. I couldn't help but think of some of the extreme cases. This is, full disclosure, this is a good friend of mine. I went to college with Ellen Garrity, who is a communications director now for Sloane's and Kenyon Auction House in Washington, D.C. And Ellen how should we say, a great enthusiast of the color green. And you can imagine if you're in an auction house, you see tens of thousands of objects, a season, and a lot of them are green. And so Ellen has accumulated this house full of green things, and it's a collection that continues growing. I had an email from her the other day as I was preparing this lecture last week. She just popped out of the blue to inform me that she was getting a second storage unit. For green stuff. It's all full of green. But here the Bethesda magazine, Bethesda, Maryland, did a feature on her, and there she stands in her apartment with some of her green stuff. The obsession, I think, just to go back here, the obsessiveness shows in Ellen in a kind of playful way. Here's another case that Munsterberger mentions. He doesn't mention Ellen Garrity. He was not aware of her when he wrote. But he speaks also about this man who collects bells of all sorts, from alpine cowbells to Tibetan prayer bells. And Munsterberger interviewed this guy at length, and as it turns out, this man had been brought up in a Roman Catholic missionary orphanage, under very grim conditions, and had this miserable childhood, and that the sound of the church bells, that the church next to the orphanage, the sound of the church bells were the one of the handful of things that really cheered him up, and so he had this lifelong connection to bells and built up a world-famous bell collection. Munsterberger also tells us that while we think of the object collection as the classic collector's collection, there are also other ways to collect. He mentions, of course, the famous case of Don Juan, Don Giovanni, the great seducer of the 17th century. And this was a man who collected experiences, collected. Hey, I don't need to waggle my eyebrow at you for you to get that. It's but here it's the seriality of it, and that the sort of thrill of the chase that I think some of us who collect can relate to. I had a funny also last week as I was writing this lecture. My daughter is 6 years old, and she has license plates have caught her fancy. So I made her a little license plate book with a page for each state plus the District of Columbia, and there's a little field where she can write. The colors that are on the license plate, another field where she can write if there are any pictures, little icons, and then a sort of notes field for extra information. Oh, and then also where she saw it. So this is in the car as we drive around, and it's amazing, actually, just if I may digress for a moment. Within about a week, we had 35 states, and then the next week, 8 more trickled in, and the third week and now we're all the way up, about 3.5 weeks in, we're all the way up to 50. We're missing Mississippi, all right? So there I was over by Albertsons on 30th Street, and I was driving not with my daughter with the license plate book, but with my son, 5-year-old little brother, and we saw Mississippi. But it doesn't count, right, unless Ellie is in the car to see it. So we had a kind of quick conference, me and the 5-year-old, and we decided that if it is true that about 1/3 of all trips are you going from home to somewhere else, 1/3 of them are from somewhere else to another place, and 1/3 of your trips are from another place to home, we had about a 33% chance of chasing this Mississippi person to his or her home. And then we could go back. We could go back and get it later. So I stepped on the gas, and the Mississippi people headed out towards Mount Pisgah, and we chased them, and then we got to I-5, and they got on southbound, and I thought, hell, it's over. But then I thought as we were driving back, where were we? And I thought that that really is literally the thrill of the chase. I mean, it was really fun. And this to me is kind of the unruly passion of collecting. There are aspects that are very, very calculated, aren't there? Right? But then there are also aspects where you just let go and give yourself over to it. Munsterberger quotes Walter Benjamin, who says this. He's talking about the joy of collecting. And Benjamin was a scholar, art theorist, cultural theorist more broadly, mid-20th century, and he collected books more than anything else. And he speaks of this idea of the magic circle. And let me just read you this. The most profound enchantment for the collector is the locking of individual items within a magic circle in which they are fixed, right as the final thrill, the thrill of acquisition, passes over them. And that kind of simultaneity of the end of that chase, and the setting of that object into the circle. For my daughter, my 6-year-old daughter, it's inscribing it into the little book. There it joins all the other 50 states, except that it didn't. Here, there is something, I think, very, very, he's got it. He's got it there. And just as you set it within the circle, that object is never going to be quite as interesting to you again as it was in that moment. Yes, you take your things out, you look at them, you examine them, you study them, you research, you get more information on them. There are other subsequent chases, right? The chasing down of information, the chasing down of people with whom to converse over them, or maybe people chase you down. And but there is that moment. So I thought that's the kind of background. I thought that I'd take us through some collecting ideas by picking out 3 collectors, and they're from 3 different centuries. They're pursuing 3 different agendas, and until I was invited to give this talk, I'd thought about each of them in different moments of my life, but I'd never put the 3 together, and they are, as you see on the board, Lorenzo de' Medici at the far right, the what do you want to call him, sort of politician, banker, and strongman of Renaissance Florence, a great taste setter. And then at the left, from the 17th century, the artist Peter Paul Rubens, who was one of the, not only an artist, but also one of the greatest art collectors of his day. And then in the center, Albert Barnes, who the medical doctor and scientist who built up a great fortune at the beginning of the 20th century, and along with that, built up one of the greatest collections of avant-garde art in America, well ahead of his time. And you may have been following in the news the Barnes Foundation and the recent reopening of the Barnes Foundation on the Benjamin Franklin Parkway in Philadelphia. Who's been there already? Oh, good. Okay, 1, 2, 3, and me makes 4. So I'll show you some of these. But let's start with Lorenzo. Who, as I said, I think the Medici are familiar to most of you. They are a family that rises within the Florentine Republic. They are a banking family, a family with sort of old noble roots as well, but a family that really builds its power on banking, and the Medici Bank has branches in all of the major trading centers in Europe, which also creates a network that they used for political information and for political influence, and also for art collection. And the core of the empire is here at the Palazzo Medici in Florence. This is Florence, Tuscany, not Florence, Oregon, right? I occasionally have to clarify that with some of my students, but no, I'm kidding. Actually, I don't. They know where. They know Florence, Oregon, does not look like this. The Palazzo Medici, where the offices of the bank are, where the residence of the family is, and also where they hold the caucus of their political faction. And this is interesting. The Medici never actually become dictators of Florence in the 15th century. That comes later in the 16th century. But for 85 years, they're basically running the Republic as kind of puppet masters. They, this is an idea that's still with us today, but just the Medici did it on a larger scale. They bought a whole slew of politicians and convened the caucus in their palace, determined how the caucus was going to vote, and then sent them out to do that. And so while the Medici were not actually holding office in the Republic, they were running the Republic increasingly as the 15th century went on. So it's slippery. You wish to think of the Medici as rulers, but what they're actually involved in is a much more subtle process that needed subtler handling. The art collecting is part of that. Of course, like everything that the Medici put forth about themselves, about their public image, it is rooted in ancient Roman precedents. And this is a century in which Romanitas, or Romanness, was of paramount importance. When you think about ancient Roman collectors, there are a lot of them you can think of, but Maecenas is perhaps the most iconic. And the Medici fashioned themselves, and Lorenzo de' Medici, as the head of the family after the death of his father, they fashioned themselves as modern-day Maecenases. The collections that accumulated in the Palazzo Medici included, as you would expect, a lot of ancient Roman objects. Here's an example, and let me say ancient Greco-Roman objects, because of course this is this Tazza Farnese, which takes its name from a later subsequent owner. This is a Hellenistic object thought to come from Egypt, and it's a cup. The image, the cartoon at the lower right, is just to show you how such an object originally would have been rigged up with a separate stem, and you would have, ostensibly drank out of something like this, although, of course, it's much more precious than even the things that the Medici would use for daily use. It is made out of semi-precious stones of that kind of layered, veined type where the highly skilled artisan who makes something like this carves into it, and the depth at which you carve determines the color, right? As you go from this dark, chocolate brown to a pearly white, and then with all these grades of kind of golden yellow and brown in between. So it's we're looking at a work of extraordinary refinement, right? This ancient Roman, they call it the art of the gem, right? And we use gem more broadly now, but when the Medici would have talked about gems, they were talking about these striated materials, and the Tazza Farnese was notable not only for its size, it's about this big, but also its fineness. And this was I put it in the notes up there. Lorenzo de' Medici went down to Rome as ambassador for the coronation of Pope Sixtus IV. And at the same time, he had the opportunity to meet with the Pope because, after all, the Vatican owed a lot of money to the Medici Bank, and there were there was a kind of courtesy forgiving of a part of that debt, and also a courtesy gift of a whole bunch of objects from the collection of the old dead Paul II Pope. And so this was really, this gift purchase was a very canny maneuver on Lorenzo de' Medici's part. He got a pretty good deal for his money, and people are often willing to give up objects more easily than they're willing to give up cash. So he got payment, and this formed the nucleus of the greatest collection of antiquities of its time. The collections at Palazzo Medici under Lorenzo included a whole series, or not series, let me say a collection, piece by piece by piece. I don't mean to imply that it's a matching series, but an accumulation, let's say, of ancient Roman emperor busts. Interestingly enough, while any emperor bust was a treasure, the good emperors like Augustus or Hadrian, both of whom you see here, good emperors are better than bad emperors. It is better to have Hadrian in your Salone than it is to have Nero or Caligula. And the point here is that these are not just art objects. Okay, they're not being collected for their beauty and the fineness of their surfaces, or the beauty of their compositions. They are also being collected iconographically. Okay, what Lorenzo de' Medici is doing is arranging an iconography, surrounding himself with things that add layers of meaning to his own personal presence, whether he's meeting with people from the bank or people from the political faction or ambassadors or just social guests. These things add meaning, and in this case, forcefully positive meaning to him. I should say that the collection of Lorenzo de' Medici was dispersed about 2 years after his death, and there have been real efforts to identify and reconstruct the collection based on the inventories and tracking down, where different things went. In some cases, they don't know. Okay, the things that I'm showing you are things that actually are confirmed as having been in his collection. He had a whole bunch of medals, ancient Roman medals and coins. And here you see another good emperor. This is a coin of the Emperor Trajan at the top. And then down below, I'm showing you two of Lorenzo's own commissions, 2 medals that he commissioned from contemporary artists of his own day. And you can see right here that the sources that he's got in his collection are fueling the ideas that he's handing to his contemporary artists. There is a, look at the 2 profile busts, the way that the text is incorporated there into the edge, with space given for where the bust overlaps into the ring where the inscription occupies. These compositional ideas are not only handy inspiration, but they also, again, help Lorenzo de' Medici set up imply parallels between himself and the ancient Romans that they're all emulating. There are other conversation pieces here. There's the Marsyas, which is still in the Medici collections that have passed to the Uffizi. This is an interesting story. Marsyas, you see on the left, he dared to challenge Apollo. He was a satyr who thought he was pretty good playing the panpipes, okay? And he said, I can play as well as Apollo. And you never say that. Just word of advice to all of you. Don't ever say that, because next thing you know, poof, Apollo comes out of nowhere and says, oh, well, how about a little contest? And the prize in this contest was, other piece of advice, always make sure that you decide what the prize is before the contest. They just said loosely, you can have anything you want. And at the end, Apollo won, obviously, because he's a god. And he took as his prize Marsyas's skin. And so here Marsyas is tied to a tree, about to be flayed, to have his skin peeled off of him bit by bit. How is this a conversation piece? It is about authority, okay? And don't recklessly question authority, or you could end up like Marsyas. Don't recklessly question Apollonian authority. And who's Apollonian? Apollo, first and foremost. But who else is Apollonian? Is Lorenzo de' Medici, because in his very patronage of the arts, he becomes a sort of terrestrial Apollo, right? Because Apollo is also one of the patron gods of the arts. So you can see how certain conversations might have circled around these things. So while they are beautiful and coveted objects, they're also purposeful. More poetically, here you see the sleeping Cupid. Lorenzo had several sleeping Cupids in his collection, and I chose this print instead of a photograph, which because it's accompanied with a verse from a poem by Virgil, which talks about the power of Cupid, and hence the power of love, right? Which quells the fierce tiger and the savage lion, even. And so you can also see how these things become conversation pieces, springboards to erudite and even poetic conversation. The Medici not only, rather Lorenzo, not only collected ancient things, but also commissioned new artworks, thereby not only being rooted in the classics, but also showing himself as a kind of avant-gardist with that cultural authority of avant-gardism. Here are just two examples. The painting is Paolo Uccello's Battle of San Romano, with all of its advanced apparatus of mathematical perspective, or Antonio da Pollaiuolo's Hercules and Antaeus, which shows the musculature of the human body in motion, in tension, this kind of dazzling display of modern Quattrocento anatomical knowledge, right? This kind of intersection of science and art. Of course, also both of these furthermore suggest the connection of the Medici to Florence. Hercules is the old kind of patron of Florence, the pagan patron of Roman Florence. Florence was a Roman city founded by Augustus. So Hercules has always been this symbol of Florentineness. And the Battle of San Romano is something that is a battle that was an important battle in the history of the Florentine Republic's perpetuation of its own independence in the face of enemy invasion. So here again, you walk into the Palazzo Medici, and not only do you know that your friend Lorenzo is cultivated, but he's also the boss. Remember, Marcia's, and he's also looking out for Florence. So it's a kind of there are levels at which you can read these things. The most intimate place in the Renaissance prince's house is, of course, the studiolo. And Lorenzo's studiolo does not survive. It was recently reconstructed in the Victoria and Albert Museum's domestic, what was that called? At-home domestic life in Renaissance Florence, something like that. And I don't have a photo of the Victoria and Albert's reconstruction, but I'm showing you here something of the same type, the Duke of Urbino's studiolo at the Palazzo Ducale in Urbino. There's another really good one in the Metropolitan Museum of Art from the ducal palace of the same duke at Gubbio. He had several palaces that he moved around from. And you can see here the cabinets in which all the precious things, the metals, the kind of the small scale things, the gems, these cabinets are all around you, and they are themselves precious objects because the cabinet doors are inlaid in wood in this wonderful sort of trompe-l'oeil illusion of treasures themselves. So you open up the door with treasures on it to find your treasures. And then up in the upper register, you see that set of paintings circling all around. That is a series of what they call uomini famosi, famous men. Okay, and there also, by the way, there is a female parallel, the cycles of the donne illustre, the illustrious women. But in this case, the Duke of Urbino was interested in men. I mean, he was. I don't mean he was interested in men. I mean, he was here celebrating this kind of constellation of worthies from recent and ancient history, into which he's implicitly setting himself. As I said, to go back to the Medici Collections, they were dispersed in 1494, 2 years after Lorenzo de' Medici's death. And here, this is a weird one. This is a Raphael designed tapestry for Pope Leo X, who was born Giovanni de' Medici, so he's from the same family, but made his career in the church. He had Raphael do this whole set of scenes from the Acts of the Apostles. Here is Christ giving the keys of authority to St. Peter. But what's notable here is that Leo X, Giovanni de' Medici, who grew up to be Pope Leo X, put biographical scenes of himself in the borders. And one of those shows actually the sack of the Palazzo Medici. And there you can, I hope, make out the great heavy masonry of the palace. And here are these hoodlums making off with paintings, with sculptures, there, and with books and chests full of who knows what. Why would somebody actually depict the looting of his own palace, his own family palace, in a cycle devoted to his life? And let's leave aside the whole question about why would you put your life in the borders of the Acts of the Apostles and hang them in the Sistine Chapel, which is where these things hung. Let's just go with the question, why would you celebrate the sack of your own palace? Number one, it shows the famousness of your collection, okay? But number two, something happened. After the palace was looted, all the hoodlums who took the stuff started selling them on the market, and Medici partisans bought up the things one by one. And when the Medici returned from exile, these partisans gave the things back as gifts to the Medici, thereby, in the gift-giving, kind of reinforcing those bonds of obligation. And so here you get a story that's about collections and the dispersal and partial reunion of the collection that redounds to the fame of the family. Of course, Lorenzo goes down in history as Lorenzo the Magnificent. You've probably all heard him referred to as such. And here's just an example of his fame. 150 years after his lifetime, you get Michelangelo, Michelangelo's grandnephew. Okay, that's complicated. Decorating the palace of the Buonarroti family, Michelangelo's family palace, with a scene of Lorenzo the Magnificent seated there in the center in red, in that right-on axis, looking at a phony antiquity that young Michelangelo, who's there in yellow and purple, is bowing and presenting to him. So here this whole kind of interplay between the great artist who, the fact that Lorenzo patronized the young Michelangelo is here being shown off in history as an example of his good taste, of his insight, and of his early support of the most promising talent of the age. But meanwhile, the Buonarroti family looks to the patronage of Lorenzo as a badge of honor, and in fact as so important that they have it depicted in their palace. So there's a nice kind of circularity to it. So to sum up Lorenzo before I go on to Rubens, his collection functioned how? Okay, number one, it's visible wealth. It's what Aristotle called magnificence. Aristotle wrote a treatise, the ancient philosopher, wrote a treatise on magnificenza, this idea of spending money in a worthy fashion on things that were beautiful and that redounded to your own glory and to the glory of the civilization that you represent. That is magnificence. And, by the way, according to Aristotle, and everybody who parrots him throughout the Renaissance and Baroque, for them, magnificence is a requirement for somebody to be considered a worthwhile ruler. You cannot be a good ruler unless you are magnificent. So that's one thing. Number two, actually, you can use your objects as banking collateral, right? Or you can walk people through your palace and they understand that, you know, if you've got all this stuff on the walls, then there must be money in the vaults as well. And even if there's not, here the stuff on the walls represents wealth and therefore trust for a banking family. But then there's the personal iconography, and I've alluded to that as well. Lorenzo as Hercules, Lorenzo as ancient emperor. There's political message making, which is related. And then this idea that kind of the gesture of cultural leadership, that cultural leadership also implies worthiness for political leadership. Then there's a kind of more personal aspect. There's that intellectual exchange that Lorenzo engaged with his scholars. Gino Corti published a volume of 174 letters that Lorenzo de' Medici wrote to various people on art, his various correspondence. And as I was writing this, I read through a bunch of those again. And in these letters, you can just read the joy in not only the objects, but also in the process, in that kind of thrill of the chase, but also the joy in exchanging information and in attaining expertise, in sharing expertise, and in gathering expertise. So the collection enables this whole correspondence. It enables also bonding with allies, right? Allies are taken into the studiolo to see the collections that are displayed in the grand halls, the salone, the courtyard. That's one level of access. But if Lorenzo comes and taps you and says, "Come into the studiolo, I want to show you something," then that's that gift of intimacy, the gift of taking somebody into your confidence, and the collection is a tool for that. But then, of course, let us not forget that these are objects of personal delight and the focus of Lorenzo's passion. Yes, there are all these other usefulnesses of these things, or uses of them, I suppose I should say, but always running through the great collector is that passion. Turning to our next guy, this is Rubens, Peter Paul Rubens, Belkin wrote about him, no artist had ever before formed a collection to rival those of monarchs. And I'm showing you here Rubens's house in Antwerp. You see this red brick block. That's the house that he bought. Quite a grand house by the standards of bourgeois Antwerp. But then he added to it this block here, this kind of palatial block that looks like the palaces of Genova, this Italianate style that Rubens attained, or came into contact with during the decade that he spent in Italy as a sort of out of his youth. He was about 21 or so when he went, and he stayed until he was about 30. And here, when Rubens moved back to Antwerp, he decided to set himself up as a gentleman, okay? And the collection was a key part of this. The collection and the house were the two key components. So you come in off the street and you're faced with a view like what you see in this upper image. A view, you look across the courtyard, there's the Italianate block to your left, the Flemish block to your left, and then a gateway, the triumphal arch in the ancient manner that leads you out to a garden of delights. And then here at the lower part, you can see the garden. Now the point of view has switched 90 degrees. Here's the courtyard with fisheye lens to get it all in, but you can see this elaborate triumphal arch, and then here we go out into the garden. And look back on that backside of the triumphal arch and the backside of that Italianate wing where Rubens's studio was housed. He had always about 12 to 15 assistants working for him. Sometimes they were people as exalted as Anthony van Dyck or Franz Snyders, and sometimes it was just the little grunt, grinding the pigments. But he always had this kind of active school going on there. So the family lived on one side and the workshop on the other. Here is an image of Rubens strolling in the garden with his second wife, Hélène Formant, and one of their children. And I think in a portrait like this, you can see Rubens, and it's interesting, if you stack up, I thought of putting in all of Rubens's known self-portraits, and then I thought, no, let's stay focused on the collection. But if you believe me, if you review all of Rubens's self-portraits, unlike, let's say, his contemporary Rembrandt, who Rembrandt often shows himself as an artist, Rubens never does. Rubens never shows himself painting. He shows himself, or in a rough costume of the kind that you might use for painting, a smock, with stains on it or anything like that. Rubens always shows himself as a gentleman. And here you can see that he's wearing that fancy lace collar, a kind of gold chain around his neck, the chain which is an honor that is given to you by a prince, and assuming this very, very elegant pose. Here's another one where Rubens this is him as a young man. You see him at the extreme left, already kind of losing his hair up top, but believe me, he's in his 20s here. along with his brother and two very important scholars of the Neo-Stoic school. And these are the people that Rubens studied with. And this is a friendship portrait that not only commemorates the friendship that he had with these people. His brother died just a few years after that, and there he lost his best friend, really. But so this commemorates that wonderful time that they spent together studying, but also under the guidance there of Seneca. You see that ancient Roman bust tucked up in the niche. Well, this is 1604. Rubens has not really started his collection yet. He's traveling. He will eventually come back and settle in Antwerp and start to build around him something like what you see in this painting, in this portrait. And of course here we're back in the courtyard looking towards the Italianate block. The triumphal arch is on your left there. And if we zoom in to the pediment above the door, who do you see there presiding over all this but Seneca, right? And of course this bust that is a modern, let me say modern, 17th century, early modern, Rubens' his own era, a modern work, but a modern work that reproduces an ancient Seneca bust that he has inside. So turning to go inside, the Rubens house you can visit. Has anybody been there? Let's see if anybody's been. Okay. This is such a delightful place. You can all put it on your bucket list now, along with the Barnes Foundation. And the Rubens' collection was dispersed, but they have made an attempt to buy in things that were in Rubens' collection, or when that's not possible, to get things of the same type. And so it's a museum that suggests Rubens' collection rather than preserving it. And there are also some very good works by Rubens that are there. Here is a wonderful view as you look down this gallery. The garden is to your right out those big windows. We're in the old-fashioned Flemish side of the house, to which, however, Rubens has added through that arch at the end of the gallery there. He's added a rotunda. Okay, a rotunda that, let me just flip back here. This print that was done of the house was done by a later owner who converted the rotunda into a chapel. That's, let's say about 30 feet across, right? And this was a rotunda that he built to house the collection of ancient statues that he acquired from Sir Dudley Carleton, who was the British ambassador to the Netherlands. Dudley Carleton, who went on to become Secretary of State for King Charles I. Dudley Carleton, who wanted Rubens's paintings so much that he arranged a trade. He traded a collection of about 25 really fine ancient Roman marbles for a whole bunch, a kind of crate load of Rubens's paintings, and paintings by Rubens's own hand. So here's Rubens trading his own, the work of his brush for a gentleman's collection, and for Sir Dudley Carleton's collection. And of course, once you do that, you can't just stick it anywhere. You have to build yourself a Pantheon-shaped rotunda. So that's the scale on which he's thinking. And indeed, his house and his collection became a sort of landmark on the things to see if you are a well-connected, well-introduced person going to Antwerp. You get admission to Rubens's house. The collection includes works, Rubens's actual collection here, and what I'm showing you now are things that are scattered in all different museums, not necessarily in the Rubens house, but that were in the Rubens house in 1640 at the time of the last inventory there. He's got works by his assistants. Anthony van Dyck, his most famous one, he had 9 Van Dycks there. And this is a seduction where you've got this kind of satyr pulling the drapery off this sleeping Antiope, while Jupiter, in the form of an eagle, comes down to work his wiles. You also have works from the past, historical works from. This is a work from the previous century. Quentin Metzis's Money Changer. famous painting, and Rubens owned it at one point. He and this is Netherlandish, right? And significantly, I'm saying that Rubens is interested not just in classical antiquity, but also in the Netherlandish tradition. He also buys things like this, Martin van Cleve's The King Drinks, showing a kind of Twelfth Night revels, all these people rolling around drunk in a sort of tavern type interior. The king is, of course, the carnival king, you know, with a paper crown. But Rubens took his paintbrush to this and retouched it, and just kind of zipped it up a little bit, made it, and this is most collectors don't do this, right? But I think this sheds light, and there's a brilliant essay. I think it was Margaret Carroll who realized all this and published an essay where she pulled together about 20 different paintings where Rubens had done this, and tried to discern from them, from these retouchings and this kind of, you know, scientific examination of the paintings, what was Rubens looking for in his critique of the Netherlandish tradition? What did he think was missing, and thereby to understand him as a painter? We also have Rubens' own copies of Italian paintings. This is his copy of Titian's Woman in a Fur Coat. He traveled both in Italy but also in the royal collection in Spain. He went twice to Spain as a diplomat. This is interesting, the painter as diplomat. How do you get a painter becoming a diplomat in an era that was so attentive to the prerogatives of the aristocracy and did not really let people who worked with their hands assume high position? How did Rubens do that? How did he pull that off? One thing was that he had posed himself as a gentleman, and he had posed himself as a gentleman so successfully that that allowed a certain amount of social movement. Okay. Second point, though, is that he could sit with the King of Spain and have a private conversation while pretending that he was doing a portrait sitting, right? So there was a kind of secret agent aspect to it as well. He'd go off to these collections, though, and he'd copy the great Italian paintings and bring them back. And so he had a whole bunch of these in his house, which he used as sources and inspiration. And I think that the brushiness of Rubens owes a lot to the brushiness of Titian. And I think you can see here a kind of iconographic connection as well between Titian's Woman in a Fur Coat and Rubens's rather risque, with the tumbling breasts kind of cupped in the elbow of her arm, rather risque portrait of his second wife, Hélène Formant, which they call in Flemish Het Pelsken. He also had things like copies of Mantegna's Triumphs of Caesar, a Renaissance series, but that looks back with a very archaeological eye at classical antiquity. And then, of course, his antiquities. There's the Seneca I was referring to earlier. And on the left, a Roman 1st century AD kind of ritual piece. And he used these also as sources in his own paintings. Here, the Seneca shows up in his Death of Seneca, now in the Louvre. He's taken the stone-cold marble and breathed life into it, into the flesh. Then, of course, the gems. And I showed you the Tazza Farnese for Lorenzo de' Medici. Here, this vase, probably out of Constantinople, circa 400 AD. And I'm showing you on one side, it kind of lit in a standard way, and you see that it kind of feels pink, beautiful, kind of creamy pink. But at the Walters Art Gallery, this is another one for your bucket list, go find the Rubens vase. They have got, the lighting is so nicely done. They shine a light from above right into the thing so that it just glows, and you see that, that rich veining of this, which is made out of one single piece of rock, and it's about this big, right? This object attracted Henry Walters, who looks rather curmudgeonly here, but I assure you that he too felt the joy of collecting, and he brought it to America during that kind of great heroic age of American plutocratic collecting. Henry Walters made his money in railroads and spent it in establishing an art collection and eventually a civic museum or rather, let me say, a private museum on the scale of a major civic museum. So Rubens, just to summarize, his collection functioned differently than Lorenzo de' Medici's. He's got his collection as a repertory of artistic sources because he's actually doing the art making right there on site. Okay, so there's a much tighter imbrication there. It's also a showcase of his own and his own students' works. People come to visit the collection, and they're taken through it, and they're shown Titian, and they're shown Mantegna, but they're also shown Anthony van Dyck. So it's a promotion by juxtaposition that he's doing there. It's also an expression of his artistic ideals. This is the stuff that we ought to be looking at, is what the collection says, that we as painters ought to be looking at, but also you visitors as connoisseurs ought to be looking at. It likewise expresses his own personal iconography in many ways. Even though Rubens is not as political a figure as Lorenzo de' Medici, there are in his collection objects that speak about peace, which is one of his kind of motifs of his diplomatic work in the era of the 30 Years' War. Think about the Seneca, which declares his learning, right? You remember from the friendship portrait, but also his philosophical allegiance to the Neo-Senecan school of philosophy. And then, of course, it's his claim to social status. He collects like a gentleman, and if you collect like a gentleman enough, then you become perceived as a gentleman. And then, as Lorenzo, it gives him a kind of place, I just used the word place. What I meant to say was a forum for, or a kind of excuse for intellectual exchange with scholars, a place where he can bond with his patrons as an equal, right? If he's collecting things on a princely level, then he can talk to princes about their collections and thereby firm up those ties between patron and artist. But then, of course, let us not forget that there is a personal delight. I mean, in Rubens, a kind of revelry in his objects, and again, it's the focus of passion. So our third collector is Albert Barnes of the Barnes Foundation. And I'm very partial to the Barnes Foundation. I grew up in Philadelphia, and I went to a school in Marion, Pennsylvania, which shared a fence with the Barnes Foundation. And I would be lying if I said we went through a hole in the fence to study art history at the Barnes. We went out the front gate of our school, down half a block, and in the front gate of the Barnes. But we had our art history classes in this astonishing collection. It was only later when I grew up that I realized that not every museum has 174 Renoirs and 70 Cézannes and so on and so on. I've got some stats here: 69 Cézannes, 60 Matisses, 174 Renoirs, but also a whole bunch of other things too. Barnes, Albert Barnes, who's pictured here, was born in a very modest neighborhood, Kensington, northeast Philadelphia. His father was a butcher, but Barnes rose very quickly. He, as a relatively young man, I mean, in his 20s, he along with another partner, invented something called argyrol, which was kind of drops that you would put in a newborn baby's eyes to help stave off infant blindness. And it proved effective, and then everybody in America was using these things, and his pharmaceutical company made the 1910s and 20s equivalent of $18 zillion on this. He had very, very serious thoughts about art, and began collecting in the 1910s. He had an old classmate from Central High School in Philadelphia who was the painter William Glackens, and he sent Glackens off on buying jaunts for him. Sometimes Barnes would go to Paris, sometimes Glackens would go for him. But 1911, Glackens returns from Paris with the 20 pictures that would be the nucleus of this growing collection. Barnes studied philosophy, aesthetic philosophy, and political philosophy with John Dewey, who was at the time a professor at Columbia, and then established his own foundation for artistic and aesthetic education. And he always imagined his collection as a place for teaching and a place for a kind of social action And I don't mean social action like, hi-ho, a nice cocktail party. I mean social action like implementing a social agenda for the American working class. He had his first exhibition in 1923. It was roundly ridiculed in the Philadelphia press. Remember, the Armory show was just the decade before. That moment that is widely considered to be the beginning of the American avant-garde, and Philadelphia was not ready for it. I mean, New York wasn't ready for the Armory show, just about, but Barnes never took criticism sitting down, right? One of the critics reviewed the show in a hostile manner, and he suggested, it was a female critic, and he suggested that she had no sensitivity at all for the working man, and that the only way she ever could possibly hope to become a decent critic would be to have a sex affair with the Iceman. And I don't know if any of you remember the Iceman, but it's sort of the one of those low, burly trades, the guy who drags the ice and puts it in your ice box. Then he builds this building in 1929, 4 months, or what is it, July to October, 3 months before the stock market crash. Barnes sold everything. Just liquidated all of his business, and he had $5 million, which is like $5 gazillion in today's money, and he got out. And basically, all through the Depression, he went around buying other people's stuff. I mean, he was considered quite ruthless, but it was in pursuit of this vision. Here are a few things from that first trip that Glackens took to Paris in 1911 for Barnes. A nice Cézanne Mont Saint-Victoire, a Van Gogh Postman. Perhaps the most celebrated painting in the Barnes Foundation is this early Matisse, La Bonheur de Vivre, the beauty of life. Here is just a quote from one of the sources I've been reading in the last couple weeks, talking about Barnes's friendship with Gertrude and Leo Stein, who lived in Paris as expatriates at this period. He wrote, neither of them thought of pictures as mere possessions, but rather as embodiments of complex human perceptions and values. Okay, and I think what we have to recognize here is that Barnes is not your regular plutocrat collecting to establish himself as a kind of social presence in the Philadelphia scene. Renoir, he loved Renoir more than I love Renoir, but I always say that when you go to the Barnes, you can see how awful a painter Renoir really is, because you see 174 of them, and there was a moment when Barnes bought everything in Renoir's studio, even minor things that were of less interest. But here, speaking about Renoir, Barnes said that an artwork's degree of worth is determined by the extent to which the artist has enriched, improved, and humanize the common experience of man in the world in which he lives. And here I think the Impressionists speak very much to Barnes in a kind of social sense. That it's not yes, there's beauty going on here, but it's also about humanizing the common experience of man, taking these people who are, these are women who are wearing, you see the detail of the hat at the lower left-hand corner. These are women of the early 20th century who have taken off their sort of fashionable clothes and are kind of communing with nature, living this pastoral existence that harks back to bathing nymphs in Renaissance paintings. And yet, Renoir does not go to Arcadia. It is the suburbs of Paris, and I think that's what one of the things that Barnes is recognizing there. It's not just the modern painters, though. He also collects broadly. He has some Rubenses, for instance. Here's his Rubens. This is a small oil sketch for one of Rubens's larger church decoration projects, showing King David playing on the harp. And there are El Grecos, Tintorettos, but always set in these ensembles where you walk into a room and you see a Renoir, like you do here, but with some Picassos adjacent, maybe some early Surrealist works, maybe some Baroque works, maybe some Renaissance works, and then the whole wall is filled out with his collection of Renaissance, mainly German, but also German Renaissance, English, and early American ironwork, hinges and locks and things like that. Also, he collected early American furniture, particularly kind of farm furniture, and also African sculpture. I don't think there are any African sculptures in this particular ensemble, but he combined them in a way that was repugnant to the museum mind at the time, right? Where you want your things in different rooms, your African room, your Renaissance room, and then your Impressionist and Post-Impressionist, with plenty of decorous wall space for nice labels with curatorial information next to them. No, for Barnes, there's minimal curatorial information, and he's going for this kind of decorative ensemble, which I think honestly is a lot closer to the Baroque period eye than it is to the modern period eye. I mean, you think about how people hang things in a Roman palace. And June Kohler, by the way, when she did the European gallery upstairs, went for this salon-style hang or Baroque hang where the pictures are 3 or 4 deep on the wall and arranged in these kind of symmetrical compositions. Here, Barnes is also thinking not just about the painting, but about overall composition, but also about the resonances of juxtaposition. And he had very particular kind of theories about artistic resonances that come out of his talks with Dewey and also with Bertrand Russell, who taught for Barnes at the Foundation for a while. Looking here from the upper floor past, there's some African sculpture there. I think you can see it on the plinths in the center underneath the Miro. And these arches open out to the Great Hall, and opposite it is the Matisse mural of the dance, which is 45 feet long. Here is the Great Hall again with the Matisse along the top. Barnes, I said, he's not your normal plutocrat looking for social validation, and in fact, he was actively antagonistic to society. He loathed the art institutions that he was surrounded with. He had a particular hatred for the Philadelphia Museum of Art, which was doing everything in the opposite way that he envisioned doing it. And I don't know if you can actually make this out. We may have the brightness on a bit too much on the screen. But this is a letter from his dog, Fidel, or Fidel de Portmanèche, who often would handle Albert Barnes's correspondence for him, and would send these lambastings to the critics, and would send insulting letters to important people who tried to name drop their way into seeing the collection. Meanwhile, Barnes wanted the collection to be open to the workers. The workers in his own factory had art classes in the evening hours that were offered to them. And I mean, there's tale after tale of important people who pretended to be, iron workers to get into the Barnes Foundation, and there's a whole archive of letters from Fidel. The headmaster of this school where I went actually asked Barnes if he might be interested in selling some land during the Great Depression because the school wanted some extra playing fields. And the headmaster did not even get a letter from Fidel. He got a return. The envelope from Mr. Barnes came back. He opened it up, and inside he found nothing except his own letter torn into 32 pieces. And that's the kind of prickly person that Dr. Barnes was. Barnes wanted to make sure that after his death, none of these institutions got hold of anything of his, and so he left a very well-endowed foundation with its educational mission, and interestingly enough, a board of trustees where 3 of the seats on the board were reserved for to be appointed by Lincoln University, which is one of the historically black colleges in southeastern Pennsylvania, and so which was a very kind of countercultural move at the time, and I won't tell the whole story about the legal wranglings and all that started in around 1990 and have just concluded now with the building of a new Barnes Foundation, moving the foundation in from Marion in the leafy green suburbs to the Benjamin Franklin Parkway in Philadelphia, where, okay, so Barnes in his will said nothing can be moved. All of the arrangements that he envisioned must remain as they are, every hinge in its place. And so they came up with a sort of loophole, and again, I'm glossing over some really ugly legal stuff. They came up with a loophole whereby this part of the building here, it projects now, that's an exact reproduction of the volumes and the interior decoration of the rooms that Barnes actually had arranged at Marion. And in fact, this slide that I showed you here is a slide from the new building, even though, and they've taken great care to kind of create this jewel box. But within that jewel box, I mean, the jewel box is set rather within this extraordinary new building by Todd Williams and Billy Chen. And here you can see this is the block that houses the Barnes's own rooms reproduced now. And then there's this hovering, glowing volume of a transitional block where a lot of the circulation is handled. And then there's a block with offices and libraries and things like that back behind it. So I think, there are people who revile the new Barnes Foundation. That's another debate that has nothing to do with collecting. That has to do with something else. I think the building, I was there in February, I think it's astonishingly good. And just architecturally a brilliant solution to a very knotty problem. So to go back to Albert Barnes's collection, how does that function? Barnes's collection is very different from Rubens's, which in turn is very different from Lorenzo de Medici's. His is a social experiment. It's a school of aesthetics where he is trying to transmit his own aesthetic philosophy to a broad working class audience. And again, this gets back to this social experiment, a kind of improvement of America. It's also an expression of Barnes's own artistic ideals, of course. While Rubens was trying to position himself within a society and make himself a gentleman, Barnes's kind of iconoclastic avant-gardism was a means of positioning himself against society. He was going to collect what he wanted to collect. And spit on those to the left and right of him who were more conservative. And of course, time has been kind to Barnes's taste, right? We look at Renoir now, and he's not controversial at all, right? And I was looking it up this week. The Barnes collection, not to be so vulgar as to mention money, but it has been valued recently at $26 billion. That's billion with a B, right? So he did all right. Here again, the intellectual exchange with scholars. Barnes engaged a lot of people. I mentioned Bertrand Russell and John Dewey, but there are others as well, and had this incredibly vigorous intellectual life that he got out of his collection. But it also was a place of bonding with the common man, something that was very, very important to him. And then, so it's all very different from Rubens, very different from Lorenzo de Medici. But what do they have in common? It's these last 2 points. It's objects of personal delight and the focus of a passionate, acquisitive urge. So here we've got 3 centuries, 3 collectors, 3 agendas, and each one is so different, but they all circle back to the passion of collecting. So I don't know if we have time for questions. I'll take a few if you like.